Thank you so much for coming, everybody. If it is your first time here at Trajectory Labs, please raise your hand. All right, couple newcomers, welcome. If you need to use the washrooms, straight outside the glass doors. If you need to get back in, please use the pin printed above the keypad just outside the door. And yeah, I'm very excited to have everyone with us today. If you don't know about us, we are Trajectory Labs. So we are a nonprofit based here in Toronto that supports AI safety practitioners in various ways. We run a co-working space. We run events like these. And if you are or are interested in working on some of the most crucial problems in AI, please reach out. And we'd be interested to know how we can support you. Without further ado, I'm excited to have Kathrin Gardhouse with us here today, who'll be presenting on Redlines for AI. This is part of our ongoing Tuesday, AI Policy Tuesdays. We also do events every Thursday, which are more technical AI safety oriented. Also, a new thing we've started doing is using Slido to collect questions. So if you have questions throughout the presentation or at the end, you'll notice there are QR codes on the walls around here. If you're online, we'll drop a message in the chat in a moment. But please do scan the QR code. There's no app required. Just go to a URL and you can enter your questions there. And yeah, so on clarifications throughout the presentation, I will interrupt if there's something relevant from Slido. Otherwise, you can look at other people's questions and upvote them, and then we'll do a little Q&A session at the end. So we're doing that instead of just raising your hand and speaking during the presentation. Without further ado, please give a big round of applause to Kathrin.
Is this one on? Yeah, fantastic. Cool. Some latecomers trickling in. Perfect. Welcome, everybody. Thanks so much for joining. I'm very excited to present some work that I can take absolutely no credit for, but I have wonderful colleagues at my organization that worked on this. So a word about, okay, clicker not working, team, help. Shouldn't be. Am I doing this? Yes. Okay, cool. Okay, so that's me on the right there. I'm an AI policy researcher currently at a fellowship with the Institute for Law and AI, and in a couple of weeks I will be rejoining my previous employer, the Future Society, which is the organization on whose content today's talk is based. So my background is in law and philosophy, and I have been in this space for about a year and 10 months now. For the Future Society and the Institute for Law and AI, I'm particularly working on the EU side of things, and here in the Canadian hemisphere, I'm working with AI Governance and Safety Canada. That's a small nonprofit that is focused on policy and advocacy around AI, trying to convince the Canadian government to take seriously advanced AI capabilities and the risks that emanate from the technology, and to take regulatory actions on those issues. And this prominent figure in the AI safety space you will recognize because you just met him. Thank you for hosting. And today's topic is Redlines for AI. So how do I navigate this? Let me see. Okay. So essentially, as a quick overview of the purpose of this talk is to explain what AI redlines are, why they matter, how they can be implemented, and then what current efforts are already underway, spearheaded again by the Future Society and its allies. But to take a step back, before we focus exclusively on redlines for AI, I want to introduce the concept a bit more broadly, because this is not something that has sort of surfaced for the first time in the AI safety space. So a general definition of the term then is a non-negotiable boundary that must not be crossed. So to put a little bit more context to that, what that can mean in practice, here are some very concrete examples from past efforts where red lines have been established. One that you might be familiar with is the Montreal Protocol from 1987, which was essentially a global effort to ban certain chemicals that were responsible, so scientists discovered, for The OSA report that I'm drawing from for this presentation, the Future Society, or TFS, defines as a working definition AI redlines as follows. Redlines in AI are governance specific, and they are non-negotiable prohibitions on certain AI behaviors or uses that are deemed too dangerous, high risk, or unethical to permit. These boundaries are then intended to protect the survival, the security, and liberty of humankind. So this presupposes that AI is generally really, really dangerous stuff, which I suspect probably doesn't come as a surprise for the general audience here, because you know what you got yourself into, I assume, coming to this evening. But in general, let me recapitulate quickly. So the definition mentions two potential risk vectors. One is AI behaviors, sometimes also called capabilities. And then the second one is AI uses. There's a big overlap, of course, but to paint you a general picture how it's generally distinguished, capabilities that we consider too dangerous would be something like self-replication of AI, the possibility to essentially lose control of AI systems, self-exfiltration as well, things like that. And then in the use category, we tend to have things like the ability to autonomously execute cybersecurity attacks, to develop nuclear weapons, and the like. And so the red lines are then essentially aiming at preventing either one of those, or ideally both of those things. So some examples I already mentioned. Some of those are real examples that we have already seen in certain international framework recommendations, would be child exploitation. So to ban the use of AI that would manipulate or surveil children on a large scale. Lethal autonomous weapons I just mentioned, that would also be something where we certainly don't want AI to be involved in the use of it, because its autonomous capabilities might very easily lead to spiraling a conflict out of control that uses autonomous weapons. Social scoring is really a very much debated one as well. We see that widely used and also widely criticized in China, for example, but generally there tends to be emerging global consensus that that might not be a great idea, because we don't want to live in a world where mass surveillance is the norm, given that that really restricts our privacy and therefore our freedom. Self-replication, self-improvement is something that is deemed problematic by developers of frontier AI systems, particularly because the concern is that at a certain stage, if AI develops AI, we might no longer be able to understand its capabilities. It could be able to communicate in ways with sort of other AI systems that we can't understand, and so we just might not be able to comprehend what it's up to. And also, in the most extreme scenario, this could lead to what we call an intelligence explosion, essentially very, very fast feedback loops where AI develops slightly improved AI, and then that improved AI develops further improved AI, and then can spiral into, well, an intelligence explosion where we're suddenly no longer able to comprehend at all what AI is doing and what it's capable of. You can essentially use the analogy of the intelligence distinction between, say, animals and humans. That's potentially a scenario where we might not get out of it unharmed if we get to that. Power-seeking behavior is also really problematic, and an example of emerging consensus where a ban of certain behaviors or capabilities is being considered. And then, yeah, autonomous cyber attacks. I think that's probably fairly self-evident why that might not be a great idea. So a little bit more context then on why we need global red lines on AI. This report that I'm basing this talk on essentially determines or sets out 3 key reasons for why we need global red lines on AI. So essentially the idea is that it shouldn't be just, say, Canada or the US or maybe Europe or China to decide where those red lines should be drawn, but it's actually essential that the entire globe comes together to decide on and agree on these. And that's basically because failures or these dangerous capabilities might really propagate globally very, very quickly because these models, well, they essentially software, if you will, right? So they don't know geographical boundaries. So this is something we need to decide on together. The second reason addresses that the current incentives that underlie this race to develop more and more capable AI systems leads to cutting corners on safety, right? Because more testing gets in the way of quicker deployment of this technology. And so this race to the bottom can really only be undermined if we globally come together and say, no, these corners on safety we cannot cut. We need to make sure that the systems that we do deploy do not cross those red lines to prevent this race to the bottom, which basically means a race to no safety. And then largely, public trust really depends on enforceable limits. So these red lines need to be enforceable. We've seen examples in the past where voluntary commitments were circumvented. Perhaps you followed this, but originally the big AI labs made commitments to say, we will safety test our systems and we have external experts safety test our systems before deployment. And then look at that, they didn't make it available for external safety testing before they deployed it. So that sort of voluntary commitment might simply not suffice in this context because of the similar race dynamics that I mentioned under point 2. All right, so very concretely then, if this is such a good idea, let's take a look at where this has already been implemented. So an example obviously comes from Europe. They're often at the forefront when it comes to regulation, and so here as well. You may have heard of the European AI Act that came into force quite recently. There are certain provisions that are not yet in force, but Article 5 is one that already came into force a couple of months ago. This is a really critical one for our purposes because this is really the provision that sets out the red lines, the bans on certain systems in this particular legal framework. What's really noteworthy here, though, is that this is about a ban of AI uses specifically. So if you think back to my table from a few slides ago, we distinguished red lines on behaviors and on uses. And this particular legal provision focuses on uses only. So examples would be you can't use AI systems to exploit vulnerable groups or to use subliminal techniques. This is not a term you're familiar with. It basically means techniques that would, in a very, very subtle way, manipulate you in a way where you can cognitively not register it. So like if you, for example, include for a split second that your brain cannot consciously register an image in a video that then influences you to, I don't know, buy Coca-Cola or something like that. That's supposed to be prohibited. But there's another supporting legal framework for the EU AI, which is called the Code of Practice. This is an instrument that has been drafted over the past 10 months or so by certain industry experts, civil society, and academia. And this concretizes certain provisions in the EU AI Act, particularly those for general purpose AI models. So for our purposes, that's the frontier AI models we're always talking about, the GPT-4 and Claude, whatever they're at. And so this code of practice specifies certain commitments that these large providers of these models are supposed to abide by. And the majority of them actually have signed on to this. So they said, yes, we will not do this, or we will adhere to what I'm going to tell you right now. So essentially, in this code of practice, there's not a list of prohibited things that you can't do. They have done it slightly differently, but kind of amounts to a similar outcome. So what it does here is that it prescribes certain systemic risk acceptance criteria. And if these are not met, then you cannot deploy your system, your model. Okay. So essentially, you have to justify what you're doing. You have to write a description of the capabilities, of the risk mitigation measures you took, and how it measures up to those acceptance criteria that you set yourself. Is that a flaw? Maybe. But essentially, you have to justify whether you deploy or not, and then you have to provide a report of your reasoning to the regulator. Slight problem there that you can do that up until 2 weeks after you actually deploy it, if you do it in good faith. Hooray. But the general sense here is then, yes, the concept of red lines that you're not supposed to cross, that you're not supposed to deploy models with certain risk thresholds crossed, it certainly features here in this legal framework. The EU is not alone in this effort. There are other examples. Brazil, for example, also has a draft AI bill, a very comprehensive one. It's loosely modeled on the EU example. It's not enforced yet. It's a draft. It still needs to be confirmed by, approved by the Senate. No, sorry, it has been approved by the Senate, is under review in Congress. And it has examples of red lines as well. And then even in the US, on the state level, we have seen examples of red lines, mostly focused on uses as well, like prohibitions of manipulation, discrimination, and such. And then on the international stage, which is what I argue we really do need, as I mentioned, that these technologies cross borders inevitably, therefore needing really global coordination, are the following. So there's a Council of Europe Framework Convention on AI. This is a binding international AI treaty that establishes certain prohibitions that are based in human rights. So you can't violate certain human rights. The Seoul AI Safety Summit, I probably shouldn't call it that, but that summit also essentially led to certain intolerable risks being recognized by signatories. The G7 Hiroshima AI process similarly says that there should be a ban on AI that undermines democracy and other things. And then there was a convention in, Beijing, where leading scientists advocated for red lines for, very importantly, certain capabilities, such as self-replication, power-seeking AI, deception, cyber attacks, and weapon development. So really good to see that there are initial efforts, or it gives legal validity to the code of practice. Then you can essentially use this code of practice to demonstrate that you comply with the AI Act. So it's essentially a vehicle that you can use to demonstrate compliance with the actually binding legal act. But you can do so in different ways as well. So Meta, for example, is the one big frontier model provider that didn't sign on to the code of practice, which doesn't mean that they don't have to oblige with the obligations under the AI Act, but it does mean that they, on the face of it at least, decided to follow it in a different way than by the code of practice. But essentially, the commission said that they would exercise greater scrutiny of providers that don't sign onto the code of practice. And so depending on what other opportunities or possibilities there are to comply with it, Meta might be incentivized to at least like peek at the code, take a look and see what they're supposed to do there so that they get the regulator to agree that they indeed do comply with the UAI Act. So it's a little bit tricky, but for purposes of today's presentation, you can basically assume, yeah, kind of. So let me see. Yes, the key challenges. Yeah, I was just mentioning, so geopolitical fragmentation is a major issue here. So one example I mentioned earlier already is that there is general disagreement on some of the details of what should be banned. So social scoring being a popular practice in the Chinese context, particularly on the local level. This is exercised, quite extensively, whereas in the EU, for example, social scoring is particularly listed in Article 5, which is banning certain AI uses. So if you want to agree on global red lines, you need to sort of come to an agreement there, but there are hurdles to that. Okay. The other problem on that front is the general strategic competition. I mentioned earlier this concept of a race to the bottom, right? So it's not only within the US that the big frontier providers are competing for the lead when it comes to AI capabilities, but this is also a competition between states, particularly currently at least, between the US and China. And so the concern is that, well, if I implement certain limits to my capability development, if I can't make sure that my competitor also does that, then I have an incentive to not do so myself and keep cutting safety corners. So these competitive dynamics are quite problematic, and you need to make sure that if you do put red lines into place, that they are enforceable and that the parties to an agreement trust each other sufficiently to actually implement that and not to do some like free riding. The big advantage that the AI red line policy intervention has is that it really only focuses on the most, or at least that's kind of like the suggestion, is that it only focuses on the most dangerous behaviors and uses. So it doesn't try to get into the nitty gritty with like what can you do and what can't you do. It really says what is the most egregious, the most dangerous stuff, where you would basically on a common sense basis agree that everyone has an interest in this technology, ideally not being developed, but certainly not being deployed. So that the idea behind it is that this is not supposed to stifle innovation, because if you were to develop and deploy such a thing, it might really be the end of it. And so it's not really conducive to innovation, because for the implementation of your technology, you need trust by your consumers. And so with this narrow focus, the hope is that even a global consensus, as unlikely as it seems from many perspectives, is more possible than other proposals at least. The second challenge is technical uncertainty. So they are really unpredictable behaviors that we have seen in testing environments at least, but also in the wild and deployment. For example, deception, self-replication, and lack of reliable evaluation tools. So model evaluation is really kind of like a nascent science or an art, some might say. And so it's really tricky to say, does my model have these capabilities now? Does it cross this red line or not? And so in the face of this technical uncertainty, even if we have a binding policy tool that or an agreement that bans certain uses or behaviors, if we can't be quite sure whether a model has these capabilities or not, this effort might be undermined to an extent. So what we can do there is basically to have the best evaluations that we have, sufficient time to evaluate models before we deploy, early warning systems when we do see issues in deployment, and also sort of like response systems in place, like emergency preparedness measures. And then the proposal basically is that the burden of proof must lie on the developer. So in other words, if in doubt, don't deploy. And so a safety case, what I want to say here in brackets, is essentially a potential mechanism where developers would be asked to provide clear evidence that they have sufficiently tested their models and that they have reached a certain level of confidence, ideally with external expert assurance, that their model actually does not show the behaviors or cannot be used for the purposes that would cross the red lines. And then the third and last challenge are institutional gaps. Go ahead and read, I'll drink a sip. So the problem here is essentially that we don't yet have the structures in place. Obviously, there are certain international bodies where state actors come together and agree on certain things, but it's not the kind of infrastructure that is yet capable to achieve the purpose that we need to establish global AI red lines that are enforceable. So essentially, we have certain multilateral statements, certain statements of intent, certain corporate commitments, but they're not binding yet. So if you recall the list earlier that I mentioned, it doesn't quite live up to the requirement that we have to make this actually enforceable. So what's required here is really thoughtful institutional design, lots of research of how this is even supposed to work, what kind of internal governance mechanisms, like who gets voting rights and like all those sorts of details is really important to flesh out. And how is enforcement supposed to work? What about concerns around confidentiality and all those sorts of things? Like really, really tricky questions that arise in the context of global coordination. All right. So the Future Societies report then proceeds to set out certain path that we can take towards a global AI red line regime. So very concretely, what is it that we are supposed to be doing then? This is a very nice graphic overview, but the content is basically the same here with some more detail. So they say there are essentially 4 complementary pathways that we should take, and we should take them in parallel. Don't put all your eggs in one basket approach, essentially. So we want to aim at legally binding treaties that are enforceable. That's sort of like the end goal, but the way to move closer to that goal would be to have international norms and declarations, something we have started to see already, where we have broad participation that can be elicited without necessarily that threat of enforcement, but to start the dialogue, to start to get people to come together into one room and negotiate these things. We can also start with bilateral agreements. They're not going to suffice in the end, but they can be a blueprint to which signatories can be added when they're ready, essentially when they're starting to be sold on the idea and when we have figured out certain mechanisms like how do we build trust among the signatories and things like that. There are also non-treaty commitments between corporations, between the AI frontier developers. We have seen those already, and they certainly have shortcomings, but they can give us ideas of what the content could look like. So if we have an agreement between X and Meta and OpenAI and Anthropic and Google and whatnot that sets out red lines that they already agree on what the most dangerous things are, then that's a great signaling value as well that we can perhaps later down the road weave into binding international agreements. So we should try to make progress on all of these fronts in parallel so that we can eventually get to legally binding treaties. And then there are certain steps that you can take to get to that. One, to build an inclusive coalition of the willing. So identify the global or national players that are already interested in this idea, that already understand the urgency and the need to do this, and start negotiations with those. Actually, I do have a slide with further context on this. Yeah, so essentially this coalition of the willing should include governments, but obviously the companies as well. They need to play ball, after all, in the end. And it should be informed by civil society, so representatives of interests that are not of a commercial nature, and academia as well. It's certainly made important contributions. And then something that's often forgotten is to include the global south as well, to make sure that we really have representation from around the globe so that we include underrepresented voices as well, even though they might not be operating at the frontier in terms of development of capabilities. The second step would be to chart a diplomatic path towards an international treaty. So the focus should first be on widely supported red lines, so where there is already crystallization of consensus, for example, on capabilities such as self-replication and on uses such as mass surveillance or child manipulation. And then we can use regional and bilateral agreements as stepping stones. So that will be helpful to start with. And then we need the technical capabilities, as I mentioned in the second challenge, right? That we are not yet there in terms of technical capabilities to reliably elicit model behaviors and fully understand what it can be used for and what the risk level really is. So we need to combine these two efforts on the technical as well as on the policy side. And then we need to assign accountability to the developers to really make sure that they do not deploy models that cross these thresholds. And we can make progress as well on what safety cases are supposed to look like. How can you provide evidence that a behavioral capability is not there? It's really difficult to prove the absence of something, as you might be aware of. And then finally, I am very happy to report that currently there is a global call for AI Redlines underway. So the necessity and desirability of this approach has been acknowledged, and action has started to be organizations that include already 9 former head of states and 10 Nobel laureates. And they represent fields from diplomacy and human rights to economics, as well as AI research. So this essentially showcases how much consensus there already exists. And then the goal here is essentially to establish, as you mentioned, the red lines on use as well as capabilities. And then this can be modeled on existing international prohibitions, which we already have in place for certain weapons. Important to point out here is that this also aligns with industry interests. So as we mentioned, this code of practice in the EU has been signed by the majority of the large frontier AI developers. So they are, in general, very much in support of this, at least on paper. And I want to say quite sincerely so, actually. We heard voices from internal stakeholders that said, we don't want to develop technology that can be this dangerous. So there's support from those that are under competitive pressures as well to take this competitive pressure off so that we can really globally agree on this is not what we're doing, and we don't have to cut corners on these important issues. Now, the reality is, nevertheless, that despite this rising awareness, there is the international progress on this is stalled. The global discourse is dominated by competition and innovation. So if you look to the US, but I have to say the Canadian government right now as well, the focus is certainly on driving innovation. The competitive narrative is certainly at the forefront rather than safety and cooperation. So there is still so much to be done to really emphasize the absolute urgency of agreeing on these things. The outlook there is, though, to have this dynamic change and to have the focus be more on safety and collective action rather than competition and innovation. And then the final slide is a fun little 2-minute video where this call is being made. This is on the internet for you to see, but we're trying to display it here as well.
A global call for AI Redlines, which more than 200 of us have signed to prevent universally unacceptable risks for AI.
AI has the power to reshape our world for the better or for the worse. It depends on what we do now. AI could soon far surpass human capabilities and escalate risks such as engineered pandemics, widespread disinformation, large-scale manipulation of individuals, including children, national and international security concerns, mass unemployment, and human rights violations. That's why dozens of organizations and hundreds of individuals and leaders, including Nobel laureates, Turing Award winners, AI pioneers, former heads of states, ministers and diplomats, and human rights advocates, have united in a global call to establish AI Redlines. This means setting limits on AI development and use, because we can collectively decide that some potential harms are simply unacceptable. Governments must act decisively before the window for meaningful intervention closes. Clear and verifiable red lines are necessary for preventing universally unacceptable AI risks. Without universal and robust guardrails, the AI race is a race to disaster.
In other words, we need red lines.
Tenemos que ponerle límites a la IA
pour prévenir les risques inacceptables de l'IA.
Tunahitaji kufafanua hatari za akili bandia.
If we are unable to collectively decide what we want to do with this technology, let us at least have the wisdom to agree on what it must never do.
Cool. So that's the awareness campaign, essentially, that the Future Society and its allies launched to increase the awareness. I thought a fairly powerful statement to wrap this up, and that's me. I have Mario join me now, and we do a little Q&A based on your slide.
In about
questions.
1 minute, we're going to start a Q&A. Okay, I'm going to start with a question of mine, which is, I'm curious about examples. You gave several examples of places. Are we on camera? Do we look good? Say yes. Yeah. Okay. Cool. All right. Thanks for the talk, Kathrin. It was great. Really appreciate you prepping it for us. Near the beginning, you gave examples of some other situations where red lines have been very effective. Like the chlorofluorocarbons for the ozone layer and bioweapons. Do you have any examples where like people attempted to deploy red lines and like it worked, but it ended up being a bad idea and causing harm, or places where they were like attempted and failed? Any negative examples?
Yeah, so we're pretty early still in exploring this policy intervention. So there isn't an example where we're like, oh, let's ban this thing. And then it turns out like, oh, actually we shouldn't have done that because that perhaps stifled innovation in an unwarranted way. There is an example where we tried to deploy red lines and it just didn't work because we didn't have the political will behind it, if that's interesting as well.
Yeah, let's hear about it.
Cool. Yeah, so that would be in the Canadian context. So there was such a thing as the AI and Data Act in draft form over a year ago now. And it had been in the making for a long, long time, but then it actually didn't work out because of the prorogation of Parliament earlier this year. I should say, though, that the AI and Data Act draft never included red lines to begin with. It had high-risk AI systems and models as something that was governed with like a higher onus, but it didn't have red lines. I remember one of my very first tasks when I worked as when I started at AIGS was to provide a red line version of the draft, which basically means like a revision of it, where we made language proposals to the draft that was currently under debate in Parliament, and we included things like capabilities that should be prohibited, and that didn't succeed. And my intuition is that even if the AI and Data Act had gone through, it probably wouldn't have with those amendments that we proposed, just because the political will was not there at the time. And hopefully that is changing now with campaigns such as these. Yeah.
Right, makes sense. Okay, another question from the audience. Sometimes strict prohibitions encourage people to just take the activities underground and can like encourage further law breaking. I mean, this is a problem not just for red lines, but like in general. And then I'll also add to that, there's like a related problem of like you have if you have really strict red lines in one area, it might just drive to other jurisdictions. Aside from just like making sure you have like as many jurisdictions on board as possible, do you have any thoughts on like how red lines can be designed in such a way to kind of be cognizant of this type of negative side effect?
Yeah, I think what I tried to highlight earlier, to really focus on the areas that are just like so commonsensical, where like it's in no one's interest to develop that. It might still happen, but the general idea is that commercial entities would not deliberately develop AI systems if they like fully cognizantly knew that this was going to spiral out of control like that. The general assumption is that they wouldn't want to do that because it can't really be in their commercial interest if AI goes rogue and does bad things for humanity. So if you limit it to these most dangerous capabilities, then the hope is that such a narrow focus doesn't threaten behavior, as you pointed out, where it would go into a different direction, trying to be sneaky about it, and those sorts of things. But it's certainly tricky because, again, as I mentioned, it's really hard to detect what model capabilities there are. So certainly an technically unsolved question how to do that.
Yeah, and then regarding this this global call for AI red lines, like right now, is it just a very, very general high level call, like we need some red lines? Or are there also kind of specific proposals for like what kind of enforcement actions and penalties there would be for crossing those lines?
I think there's a call right now to make progress on research in those areas of what that's supposed to look like. So for grants to support researchers that would want to engage in these things. But for now, it's basically to raise awareness to then get the political will going to get fund money for those sorts of initiatives. But it's fairly high level for now.
Thank you. Yeah, I think this is out of battery. So then for this global call, like this is almost like to the general public or academia rather than to a specific institution. Is that right?
Yeah, so there isn't an institution that they have pinpointed where like you should do this, like the UN or something. The idea is more so that we need to create the political will for states to come together and create this institution because we don't have something in place that exists yet. And so yes, the call is generally to the broader public so that they can essentially demand such actions from their political representatives on a state level, but also to the heads of states in general so that they can pick up this amazing idea and propose that to their parliaments, to their diplomats, and make sure that progress happens on that front.
Right, makes sense. I guess like if this goes really well, maybe in like a year or two, we'll have something a lot more concrete and like a body to go to. Yeah. So a lot of and again, this question like can probably apply to a lot of legal actions, but like today in the context of red lines, a lot of the these examples that we've given have to do with like actions or materials. But we haven't talked much about neglect. Do you know if there's much discussion about like does the concept of like enforcing neglect even apply to red lines since you kind of have to be doing something in order to cross it? Or do you see that as being relevant to the discussion? Like, okay, so for example, if you like there are certain things you can get in trouble for neglecting like certain responsibilities and you don't take actions of legally. So for example, like I don't know, like raising a child, you can like get in trouble with like you know, I guess Child Protective Services if you're not like properly taking care of like your children in certain ways, and that wasn't like because of a thing you did; it's because of something you failed to do. Yeah.
Yeah, I must almost say that the majority of the asks are like don't neglect to do this rather than do this. So for example, if you say like if you don't give at least like 3 weeks of time for external evaluators to make sure that model testing happens at the outset, then that would be a neglect, arguably, right? Like you can always kind of like framework in two ways. Like either you do have to do testing or don't neglect to not do it, essentially. Maybe I'm missing your point entirely.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Okay.
Right. What can the average person do to support Redline? So, like, I mean, most obvious thing would be to like, I don't know, is there like, are they also taking signatures for like just the general public, individuals? You know, that could be one thing. But is there anything else? Like, there's some audience members apparently would like to know what they can personally do about this.
That's cool. Yeah, so spreading the word is a great idea. You can write a letter to your member of parliament. That's always a good idea. If you have connections to, I don't know, social media influencers, go ahead and spread the word. If you have the ability to appear on a podcast, go and spread the word. I don't think they accept signatures from the public. I might be mistaken on that, but that's an action. If you work actively in AI safety, you can certainly contribute by researching relevant areas, whether that's on the technical side to have more reliable model evaluations, or on the policy side, developing policy interventions, doing research into how can global coordination work? Those are all really valuable actions to take. But yeah, everybody, I believe, can contribute to raising awareness of the importance of this.
And then regarding like uncensored open source models, for example, right now, how do you see that as interacting with Redlines? Because it's very plausible that someone could right now there are probably a lot of bad actions that could be taken that are just using open source models. And do you know if there's any proposals right now for like tracking the usage of open source models, whether or not it's like, I know some incident occurs, do they try to figure out which open source model it is and then like who and then go after the company that created it? Or is there just like do you see it more having to do with actually enforcing what is allowed to be open source in the first place, that kind of thing? And yeah, feel free to tell me if this is not actually that related to Redlines, if it's other policy areas.
It's the latter. So essentially, when it comes to open source, in case it's not obvious, but as soon as it's open source, it's basically out there for good, right? So it's not much we can do, and good luck trying to police the usage of it because it's so widely spread. The thought here is basically that yes, the cat is out of the bag when it comes to the models that are open source now, but maybe the tiger isn't or something. So we want to prevent the open sourcing of models that have capabilities that would then lead to the things that we want to prevent by establishing those red lines. So it's super relevant. So rather than not only not deploying via API or whatever other way you have to deploy closed source models, certainly do not open source it. Yeah, for sure. And there might be even an argument to be made that the threshold for open sourcing should be, I guess, lower in this case, if you know what I mean, because of the irreversibility of the deployment method in this case. So super relevant.
Okay, and then I know that we kind of said that it's global call for AI Redlines. And like, let me know if this is I'm focusing too much on that, but like, yeah, it might be like we're at this phase now where we're kind of like spreading the word about Redlines as a potentially useful mechanism. We're looking for more research needed. Like if you're looking into your crystal ball, like a few years from now, let's say we have clear ideas and like what types of Redlines you feel are most important. Could you speak a bit about what institutions or like types of institutions do you think would be best placed for basically being responsible for being the regulatory body and like enforcing them?
Oh wow, yeah, not my area of research, I'll admit. It's really tricky. It's fairly well, no, it's not fully unprecedented, right? We do have certain international bodies that do enforcement, I believe, of like, what is it, the Nuclear Weapon Convention, something or another. But it requires relevant technical expertise as well, right? To ensure that it is indeed the models with the most relevant capabilities that are captured by this. So we just really don't have that in place right now. I'm also really not an expert in general global institutions, so I don't really want to speak to that too much. I understand that there is ongoing research in this area, though, what the setup of these organizations really need to be, but it's a bit beyond my pay grade.
And then a question to help us think about, getting a broader coalition number of countries. Do you see? Okay, you mentioned before how like bilateral agreements or unilateral, I guess, declarations, or what are they? Like clearly not going to cut it, but they can be a good starting point, and then from there you want to build on a larger group. How should we think about those? Like, does the enforcement of Redlines does it scale linearly with the number of participants, or is it like kind of getting 20 countries on board is like more than twice as good as having 10 countries on board? Does it like really ramp up? Is there a certain like threshold or tipping point that tends to get met?
Yeah, good point. I mean, I think the obvious answer really is that the developing nations are probably the most relevant ones here. So I would say participation of the US is probably vastly more important than Malta signing or something, no offense, just because of the realities that that's the jurisdiction where the models are developed, and likely where you have institutions with boots on the ground that could like physically enforce this. So I would say, yeah, that, China, and then others who might be on their heels, essentially. They would outweigh disproportionately other signatories at this time, yeah.
Okay, but even if we're controlling for that, like is this something where like it's pretty much useless if we get like 5% of relevant actors involved, but it's like really really great if we get like 50% or 80%? Uh,
Yeah, I think it's a question of like of trust and legitimacy as well. So you want to have representation, as I mentioned, for example, of the global south, so that we can agree on really representative red lines, that it's not just the Western world dictating what those red lines are supposed to be constituted of, or not only China or something. I would say still any starting point is essentially super helpful just to get the conversation going. If you have the infrastructure, the institutional capacity set up at the outset, then you can always tweak and negotiate further what the details are supposed to be. As more and more players sign on and see that this is a good idea, you can sort of continue to elaborate. But I like from my perspective, it should be really a global effort because everybody will be affected, and I think it's certainly great signaling value, even if we initially have signatories that are not the large nations developing this AI systems.
okay, you kind of anticipated my next question, which was like about, well, if the enforcement is really, if we really mainly need the big players involved, why do we need the kind of smaller players like the I mean, I guess Malta isn't considered part of Global South, but like a smaller player. And so that's not so much for like making sure it gets enforced, because the AI is going to be developed in like for the foreseeable future in places like China, the US, Western Europe. So would you say the participation of the Global South is mainly just because it's valuable to have their input, but less so because it's really important for them to have buy-in?
So I would say for AI uses that we might want to prohibit rather than behaviors, it's probably still quite relevant to have as much participation as possible, especially when it comes to like inference becoming cheaper and it being possible to have these AI systems be used in nefarious or non-beneficial ways by players literally anywhere. Anyone who has a computer, basically. Super difficult to enforce that, right? So it's easiest to do it at the development stage because that's where you have currently still choking points, just a relatively small numbers of organizations developing this. But as soon as you do have open source, for example, coming into play, it's probably necessary to also make sure that you have everyone sign off and there at least being a threat of enforcement, however likely it is to that actually making a dent if you do have open source.
How realistic do you think it is to get like some sort of red line enforcement that includes both like the US and China agreeing on it?
Currently, probably not great. I'm not a numbers person, so I'm not gonna give you one. But yeah, no, not great. But I think there is still a path forward in terms of more empirical evidence arising of deceptive capabilities, of the ability to self-replicate, and for AI to continue to contribute to AI, and voices getting louder and more numerous warning about these risks, particularly from credible sources like insiders at these organizations, particularly like Anthropic and OpenAI, where we have seen this in the past. So to me, it seems like these statements, whether it's with whistleblowers or just generally people that are openly concerned from academia and so on, raising awareness and the urgency there, to me, it seems like there is a possibility because it generally is so common sense that this is necessary. So I don't think it's a negligible likelihood that this can happen.
Yeah, I'm actually a bit surprised that you don't give a more optimistic answer, at least like well, for some dimensions. Like I would imagine that like neither the American government nor the Chinese government is like a fan of or at least wants to be perceived as a place that like allows like child pornography, for example. And even like there have been agreements that have worked to a degree, at least with like biological warfare. So I'm a bit surprised by your that you didn't give it like a bit more of a optimistic answer there. Was there a specific reason for that?
I think it's basically the geopolitical position and the general unwillingness to come together and be reasonable. I think that's mainly the problem. But again, really not an expert when it comes to international diplomacy, so I might be way off. It just still seems to me that the competitive pressures and the sometimes aggressive and anti-regulatory signals that we see from the US might not be very favorable to these sorts of agreements that we might need.
All right, yeah, fair enough. We're getting some questions that are interesting to me, but like might be going beyond the scope of the presentation. So feel free to tap out. But someone's wondering what your take is on SP 53.
Yeah, I haven't had a chance to look into that yet. I pass.
Okay, I think we might call that a Q&A. Kathrin, you're going to hang around a little bit, so yeah, you guys can do your best to pepper questions in person. Everyone is welcome to hang out for a while still. But yeah, one more big round of applause for Kathrin. Oh yeah, and we're going to leave a couple QR codes up on screen. The one on the right is going to be if you're interested in coming